terms of the scoring, we have about 6 major components. The first component is the social service component, and under the social service component, we have 3 sub-components. One looks at education services, health services, and then social protection. When you look at the education component, we have 22 indicators that we use in measuring the education sub-component, the health services, 30 indicators, and then the social protection, 77 indicators. When we come to the second major component, it is the environmental services component. Over there we had 3 sub-components: sanitation, waste management, and then environmental pollution and climate change. For each of them, we have a number of indicators. Sanitation had 8 indicators, waste management 4 indicators, environmental pollution and climate change 30 indicators. Then we come to the third major component, which is economic infrastructure. We have 5 sub-components over there. The first one takes into consideration transportation issues within the cities, then housing, water, electricity, and communication services. And for the transportation, we have 35 indicators, housing 6 indicators, water and electricity 4 indicators each, and then communication 18 indicators. The next major component is the economic services. Over here we look at markets, and we will explain it further. And then we also look at the employment status of people within these cities, the livelihood activities they engage in, and the skills training availability or availability of programs that will help them engage in other meaningful livelihood activities by granting them or offering them skills.
Though out of 100, followed by Accra Metropolitan Assembly and Tamale Metropolitan Assembly. Again, the overall component score for economic services, as you see here, you have Kumasi coming up, followed by Accra Metropolitan Assembly and Tamale Metropolitan Assembly. You can see this pattern recurring almost through all the presentations that we are going to discuss. So, before you get to the metropolitan scores, these are the build-outs, the sub-metros. How well do they do? And over here, you see the Tamale Central and Tamale South sub-metros not doing well in the provision of market facilities or market services, and also the employment status and livelihood empowerment and skills training for people living in the various cities. Same for the municipalities. So these are the scores for the 20 municipalities on these 2 subcomponents, market and employment status. So it should be employment status, livelihood, but I think it's just too much, so it couldn't contain it. So the top performing municipality scored 39.1 out of 100, and the least scored 18.6. So you can imagine how well we are doing as a country in empowering our citizens with the various skills and also the space for them to transact business. The last component we are talking about here is the local government and social inclusion component. So as I indicated earlier here, you have local government and social inclusion all coming together to give you the component score for local government and social inclusion. And you will realize that social inclusion does very well across the 3 metropolitan areas. 52.4 for Accra Metropolitan Assembly, even though the least, followed by Kumasi Metropolitan Assembly 57.6, and 61.9 for Tamale Metropolitan Assembly. Overall, when you take all the subcomponents and the components together for the 3 metropolitan assemblies, how well did they do on all these subcomponents and the overall scores? So, Kumasi Metropolitan Area, social services 19.3, environmental services 61.4, economic infrastructure 56.1, economic services 28.2, local governance and social inclusion 31.8, safety, security and disaster management 49.2. So clearly you can see that for environmental services and economic infrastructure, Kumasi Metropolitan Assembly does quite well, followed by safety, security, disaster management. But when it comes to social services, the provision of health infrastructure or services, provision of education, social protection, the scores are very low, not only for Kumasi Metropolitan Assembly, but for the 3 metropolitan assemblies. I want to draw our attention to the disproportionate performance between cities in the south. Greater Accra, Kumasi Metropolitan Assembly, compared with cities in the north. Inclusive development. How well are we achieving this in the 21st century? North-South divide. Again, when you look at the major component, the state's major component, it was clear that cities are doing quite well on environmental services and economic infrastructure, and somehow on safety, security, and disaster management. But when you look at the social services, the governance of our urban spaces, and the provision of economic services, opportunities for people to live quality lives.
We've been given a lot of information. Fortunately for us, we have the local government ministry here. So in terms of linking what we've seen with policy, that will be good. And then we also have panelists who are very knowledgeable in this area. What we want to do is to look at the consequences of these findings. What does it mean? So we'll do a lot of linkages in our panel discussion. We'll encourage all of you to participate. Even though we have a panel, we'd like all of you to join us in this, because I know that you all come from various backgrounds, and so it will be useful.
It seems to be telling on the statistics, what we're seeing. I believe that if it was on the broader scale, looking at it in terms of Ghana, would have seen some appreciation in the some of the services and infrastructure that are being provided. So I think that is my initial take on the presentation that is done, and then I will go on with other things later. Thank you.
Probably what I could also say has to do with the complex nature of our urban space. Whether we are going administrative or we going functional Accra, because the services that we are mentioning actually overlap administrative boundaries. And so I live in Oyarifa, and I stagger 4 to 5 administrative boundaries. So if you interview me on my perception of a city, which city? I live in Lankwantanang Assembly. I cross into Gulf House, Ayawasu. When I'm in Accra, I'm in AME. And so again, this whole conversation around the boundaries of our city becomes a challenge. I can understand why the researchers would have this challenge. Nevertheless, it's a very useful addition to the space. And I'm also looking at how it ties in with the existing efforts, similar efforts. I didn't see much of that, and I was hoping that I could see similar efforts are
have been going on, the GSAM project, the FIFA project, the district tables are all, we could learn a lot from them. Those are my initial reflections on it.
It's not usually known to be conducting studies on about space, so this is a novelty. And in my perspective, I think that I cannot disagree with some of the comments made by my colleague panelists. I think that it is also deepening the local governance and urban development. And the fact that we have crossed the urban divide and we are urbanizing, but it's nebulous. What are we talking about? Are we talking about urban centers or we are talking about cities? So that conversation has begun during the recent Ghana Urban Forum, when we need to think around the definition of urban centers using only population threshold versus other variables. So it's a conversation that is good, the platform is good, and we thank you to be associated with this process. Thank you.
So what's the final, how do we settle that score from the ministry's perspective? What's the definition?
So as of now, the Ghana Statistical Service standard, a population, an area which exceeds the population of 5,000 is an urban center. That's how come we are 56.7% urbanized per the 2021 population housing census.
And there have been a proliferation of, the number of metros or municipal assemblies carved out has been about some 400% increase. Now, the question that raises is, if you are doing work in Accra, let's remember that the problems of urban areas are not very confined to specific portions. You cannot address the problem of AMA without, there are some very critical problems around AMA that you cannot address without having some linkages around maybe Ayawaso East, Ayawaso West, and so definitional problems are significant in different dimensions. So you can talk of Accra in terms of the Accra Metropolitan Assembly or the Greater Accra Metropolitan Area or the emerging concept of the city region. What exactly are we referring to? And these are very important because these jurisdictional kind of issues are also actually raising or creating some kind of dispute issues, among some of the assemblies, especially in terms of who collects revenue from this point. I know for a very long time the Accra Mall area was a subject of contention as to whether it belongs to LADMA or LECMA. Who collects revenues there? And occasionally, revenue authority, revenue officials would clash and have disputes. So it became a point of who got there first. It's not a point, it's a matter of, if my revenue authorities get there first, they take the revenue. If yours get there first, they take the revenue. We can't develop by adopting this kind of siloed approaches to developing our urban centers. So it's clearly an issue that we need to think a lot more about.
All right, so I want us to get into the issue of 40-something and then you are the best. But it also talks about the standards that we have, right? So I want to get your thoughts on the scores. So clearly, largely from the presentation, we see that Kumasi, and Kumasi is doing better. Even though the scores are low, they are still the best. Yeah.
Sure. In terms of scores, the scores is a function of the indicators. And so if you have an indicator that really captures, we have the material and non-material issues around the city. And so if you begin to calculate and the bundle of indicators that you propose, there are other proposals. The SDG, for example, has a different typology for indicators. So if you pick the SDG city monitoring framework, and the country currently is pursuing the SDG approach. Now, if district assemblies are to draw from the SDG framework to the medium-term plans to their annual action plans, and you want to hold them responsible, you need to align. So I think the scoring would require a certain alignment. subsequently as we proceed on this discussion. If you score certain cities, for example, competitiveness of cities, it's a very big issue today. When you look at cities, cities are supposed to drive change and development. And so this basic needs approach, these are very basic. The DPAT assessment and all of the assessments are looking at the very basic minimum threshold. Unfortunately for us, cities are supposed to do basic plus. And so the basic plus will require you to have a certain length. So how competitive is your city? How attractive is your city? How sustainable is your city? These are very bigger issues that may not be captured at this level.
When you read Section 12 of the Local Government Act, the functions are there. Nothing should happen in the local authority without taking cognizance of the authority. They are the planning authority. So
When you say the authorities,
local authority, assembly,
Okay.
with assembly. So when you read, it says all government corporations and even NGOs cannot operate in the jurisdictions of the assembly without taking cognizance of their work plan, whether whatever they are doing ties in their priority. So moving forward, devolution of water, health, education, electricity has not happened. But per our laws, municipal services touches on all these. So when you say health, education, what are you measuring the entities? Or is it perceptions? And these perceptions of the citizenry in these areas we talked about, or we did feel that we don't have access to urban water because AMB is not provided. Where are these? Water, Ghana Water Company doesn't provide water. It's CWS or community water, something, urban water small system. I don't even have it in my house. I have to be buying water. I'm just trying to say that these are not under the direct control, but the law says we needed to work with the local authorities. I'm bringing it to the fore so that practitioners, experts here, must be able to talk about it. Are we devolving? Are we interested in devolving our function? So when you devolve, the latter I will talk about is funds follow function.
That, to include, for example, citizens working together with the local assemblies in terms of development. And we've had situations where individuals have walked to the assemblies, proposed ideas, but have been turned down. I'll give you, at the recent, when we met at home for the validation of the national policy, for example, I remember the Professor Oche who made that submission that in the community where he lived, they proposed to the assembly that they wanted to fix their own roads. They were prepared to contribute money to do that so that they would, for 5 years, they're not going to pay any property tax. The idea was mooted by the DCE at the time. So when you do something of the sort, you break people's spirits. Because the issue of self-help has been proposed way back in the 1960s. I've even read thesis, the late Ofeda, the former mayor of Accra. That was his thesis at the university. He had made that proposal long ago. Have we been able to work with that? No. And sometimes it's the behaviors of the assembly. The same with Fairmont, where we have this hotel that most of the ministries have been visiting, going to do their programs. The hotel had proposed to the assembly over that they wanted them to provide them with an excavator to just grade the road. They are going to buy the fuel, pay for the labor. They said, bring the money to us, and they will do it. And that also led to something else. So, when citizens are given the opportunity to be part of the development process, that is where some of the things that Professor is saying would also come into play. Then everybody will see him or herself as part, a player in the development process. So I think it's about time we begin to see these things and then address them appropriately. Thank you.
Okay, so two quick points. I mean, the first actually relates to I think one of the questions you posed initially in terms of the figures. What do the figures actually mean for policy? I mean, one of the suggestions that I like to make is whether probably going forward, for purposes of lesson learning, we may want to in order to make the figures even more helpful and useful, whether we may want to introduce a little bit of qualitative dimension so that people can have a better sense of the reasoning behind the numbers. So, for example, the figures show that Tamale is doing better than Accra in terms of housing. But it doesn't mean that citizens of Tamale have better access to housing than those in Accra. It may mean completely different things. Tamale actually does better than both Accra and Kumasi in terms of social inclusion. Do we have a sense of what exactly the Tamale Metropolitan Assembly is doing in promoting social inclusion so that other city authorities could possibly think of how best they could adapt or learn from that? So I just get a sense that, I mean, we can do a little bit more to actually even make the data or the figures even more helpful as far as issues of policy making.
So are you by this throwing it back to the researchers? So I thought maybe the other assemblies or the ministry could pick that up so that you can learn lessons from other places.
So I think so. This is actually more in relation to the data. So CBG is helping to generate data, and the essence of the data is to help inform evidence-based policy conversation. So I'm actually talking of how we can actually make the data even richer so that it will be much more helpful for policymakers in terms of thinking of, okay, what to do. So for example, one of the objectives is to help promote citizen accountability.